The Vice President, JD Vance, has made it tough for himself to convince some here that he views the UK and Europe as an ally. But others around him describe his thoughtfulness and philosophical approach. One of those people is the man referred to as his British Sherpa, friend and Cambridge University Professor of Philosophy of Religion, Dr. James Orr. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme, Dr. James. How long have you known JD Vance for, and was he always this difficult? Afternoon.
Oh, goodness, I've known him for probably the best part of a decade now. And no, I mean, I don't think he's difficult in private or in public. I mean, he might be difficult for a certain class of elite bureaucrats and Whitehall officials and Downing Street, but he has a great love for the British people and for Europe itself. And I think that's what motivated his very sharp remarks in Munich a few weeks ago, which were directed not at Europe, but what he sees as an increasingly out of touch and democratically unaccountable European elite that does not have the interests of the European people at its heart and is betraying the kind of founding values and commitments to freedom of speech, freedom of association that America has always looked to Europe for.
Were you surprised with the way that he conducted himself in the Oval Office with President Zelensky, with the "have you even said thank you once" stuff?
Well, no, I wasn't, because I watched the whole thing. I didn't watch just the 2 or 3 minute clip at the end of an hour-long meeting. I watched the whole thing very carefully.
We all did too, yeah.
And what was quite clear over the course of that meeting, which was overwhelmingly amicable and perfectly polite until the end, was that Zelensky was needling them at various points and did not conduct himself in a way that suggested he was open to the Trump-Vance commitment to finding a path towards a peaceful and prosperous Ukraine. The vice president has always, in fact, last time he was in England, we talked a lot about this. This is a couple of summers ago, and he wanted to understand the European perspective on NATO and the hawkishness on Ukraine. And I think what baffled him was that you had a Ukrainian government driven by Zelensky that was insisting on putting, up to 2,000 Ukrainian men into the meat grinder and wrecking Ukraine, wrecking its infrastructure, making it almost impossible for the country to recover, for apparently zero military gain.
Or the pushing back of Russian forces out of territory that it invaded, which they had done relatively successfully in parts of Ukraine.
Look, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but last time I checked, in March 2022, just a short 2-3 weeks after the invasion, Russia held roughly 19% of the eastern half of Ukraine. Today, last time I checked, Russia holds roughly 19-20% of Ukrainian territory. Yes, there's been a little bit of back and forth like there was in the First World War, but at what cost? It's a colossal cost in human life, wrecked families, and geopolitical stagnation. And so I think, the Trump-Vance vision is peace, prosperity. That does not mean just caving into Putin. It means making sure that the proper demands are issued, but it's also trying to adopt a realist posture. The idealism of the last 3 years has just not made any headway at all.
Were you surprised to see JD Vance support fall in behind run with President Trump, given his previous comments about him, calling him a Nazi? What was the change of mind, do you think? Or was it political realism? This guy's going to win. I want to be attached to a winner.
No, I don't think it was. The first point to make is that the willingness to change one's mind is the only sure sign that one's got one. Those comments were made several years ago. Sorry?
It's a hell of a change of mind from Nazi to freedom fighter.
Not really. If you read Hillbilly Elegy, his New York bestseller in 2016, you'll remember that was in many ways a kind of a paean, a tribute to an America that, in his view, and I think all the evidence backs it up, was disintegrating, that was being shattered. And I think he looked at Trump in 2016 and thought, I'm skeptical that a limousine liberal who's made his money in New York real estate in the 1980s and 90s can really, truly understand what it's like to grow up in Ohio and Appalachia in the 80s and 90s. And Trump changed his mind. And it wasn't politically convenient for him. If you remember, when he gets into the Senate in 2022, he is a lone voice supporting Trump at a point when nobody really thinks Trump has a snowball's chance in hell of winning in 2024.
So he saw that Donald Trump was on the side of the people from where J.D. Vance came originally, or his family in Appalachian poverty, and saw Trump as a help for them.
He correctly saw that Trump, as a Republican candidate, was more sincerely committed to advancing the interests of American workers and the dispossessed of the flyover states than any Republican presidential candidate in living memory, and indeed any Democratic presidential candidate in living memory. I think the way to understand the vice president, despite his very obvious and sincere loyalty to Trump, is that he is first and foremost loyal to Trumpism. That's why he was picked when it would have been electorally convenient to pick almost any other candidate. Trump went for Vance because he understood that Vance was committed to Trumpism, that, as it was, as I've said before, the Donald needed a Dauphin, and Vance was the most obvious candidate for that. Trump was well aware of what Vance had said about him before, and I think it's a sign of Trump's emollients and Trump's willingness to forgive and move on, that, as with selecting Marco Rubio, for example, as Secretary of State.
Well, when it comes to the UK, does he really believe that the UK has become the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? Is that a sincere belief, or is this sort of fodder to the media?
I was in the room when he made that remark. It was an after-dinner speech. It was uttered plainly in jest. The audience laughed when he said it, and he smiled when he said it.
So he doesn't believe that?
I think what he does believe, and what many, many Americans believe when they look across to the United Kingdom, is that we are not the unified nation that we used to be. I remember telling him last July he wanted to know all about the election, and I mentioned in passing that for the first time ever, we had 5 MPs elected on a ticket that was explicitly committed to the interests of a foreign entity, that is to say Gaza. And that is something that is striking. It's unprecedented in the history of British electoral politics, and I thought it was worth commenting on.
But he doesn't believe we're a truly Islamist country, or does he?
I think he sees what everybody sees, that there are rising levels of sectarianism in the United Kingdom that would have shocked a Brit from the mid-1980s. I don't think anybody denies that. And I think the challenge is, how do we cope with it? How do we seek integration or assimilation, if we can? These are not controversial views. These are views that should be held by anyone willing to look at the evidence.
Good to talk to you. Dr. James Orr, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Cambridge. As you heard, a friend of the Vice President, who speaks to him relatively regularly, described as his British whisperer or British sherpa, the man who is the intellectual crutch for J.D. Vance, possibly.